Many of us fondly remember Sega's arcade sprite scaling games from the 1980s. They were standout titles that looked significantly more advanced than most of the other stuff that sat beside it. But Sega was also heavily invested in making traditional two-dimensional titles. Released in 1982, its System 1 arcade board gave birth to classics like Flicky, Choplifter, My Hero, Ninja Princess, and Wonder Boy. Sega then released a mildly upgraded version of that called the Sega System 2 in 1985. Both these platforms sported an 8-bit Z80 CPU, and Sega was looking to upgrade that technology in a pretty big way. At the very end of 1985, they decided it was time to move up to the Motorola 68000, and a vastly superior collection of sound chips, and of course a big uptick in graphical capabilities. This new board did not have an official name quite yet, but it would eventually become the Sega System 16. This technology would be the core of Sega's two-dimensional arcade releases for many years to follow, a lifespan that lasted 5 years and inspired the design of several other Sega-made arcade boards. During its run, it would see a couple of revisions itself, noted as the A, B, and C versions, which upgraded the speed, sound, and memory to give it a bit more kick. Besides that powerful 10 MHz 68000, the System 16 boasted over 4,000 on-screen colors, sprite scaling capabilities, and a set of sound chips that could really belt out some fantastic tunes. With over 40 releases to its name, I thought it'd be cool to take a look at exactly what this board was capable of, and the many classic Sega series that began life there. I hope you guys enjoy Arcade Power and the best of the Sega System 16. In 1987, the System 16 received the run-and-gun hit Alien Syndrome. This was clearly based on the popular film franchise with aliens infesting your ship and you having to rescue the crew. You get lots of weapon choices, massive bosses, and you can do it all with a friend. It's a release I wish the Genesis had gotten at launch, though the Master System did see a stripped-down port that same year. Quartet and Quartet 2 were released in 1987 as well. Quartet is a 4-player run-and-gun that featured a cabinet supporting 4 joysticks and the action buttons to accompany them. Quartet 2 was actually the same game that was sold as a conversion kit for other titles that only supported 2-player co-op. It's actually a pretty neat game, kinda like Contra, but with jetpacks and keys to open doors to the next stage. It's tough and definitely built for more than one player. I like it though. The gameplay feels different enough from the other games in the genre to earn it some respect. In 1986, Sega released its take on Spy Hunter called Action Fighter. This was a vertically scrolling car combat game where you switched vehicles as you eradicated the enemy threat. You had a souped-up sports car, a powerful racing bike, a combat helicopter, and even a jet ski. You can pick up additional weapons too, stuff like missiles and more powerful guns. It's fast, challenging, and looked great for a game of its time. I thought this was significantly better than Spy Hunter, and Sega ported it home to the Master System that same year. Unfortunately, this arcade version saw its main distribution in Japan, so there are likely many of you that have not played it before. If you enjoy car combat or shooters in general, I highly recommend it. Good old Fantasy Zone got its start right here on the System 16 in 1986. This stars the little ship Opa Opa in a horizontal shoot-'em-up that allows you to go forward and backward as you hunt down enemy bases and destroy massive screen-filling bosses. You can buy weapons with the coins you collect for some added variety, though you only get them for a limited time. The visuals are bright, colorful, and the alien worlds look fantastic. Multiple sequels would follow, but I always thought it was best right here. "1987 brought out the big dogs with Shinobi, the side-scrolling ninja action title that spawned a number of fantastic sequels itself. The original here was built around the mechanics of Rolling Thunder, where you would face enemies on multiple levels. Our hero Joe Musashi has access to different weaponry and ninja magic, as he battles increasingly difficult enemies across 5 different areas that include multiple sub-stages. Your goal is to rescue children from the evil Zed and take down their criminal organization for good. There was also a brilliant bonus stage where you must target ninja as they attempted to advance on your position. Home ports at the time were fun, but none of them came close to the arcade feel. It really makes you wish Sega had ported this to the Genesis before Revenge of Shinobi. There is a fan translation in the works that hopefully gets finished. There are so many Wonder Boy games, it's easy to get them mixed up. When Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair showed up in 1988, it began all kinds of confusion because there would be another Wonder Boy 3 called The Dragon's Trap less than a year later. This one was a run-and-gun platformer shoot-'em-up hybrid that had colorful visuals and loads of power-ups. I didn't get to play it until sometime later when I found it on the TurboGrafx CD. I really enjoyed this though and thought it was a nice change of pace from the previous titles in the series. The Mega Drive saw a port in Japan and Europe that was pretty good too. "1988 was when the classic beat-em-up Altered Beast showed up on the System 16. I still remember seeing this in the arcade for the first time and being blown away. It looked so cool and the cinematic transformations were really impressive. It even had some cool little sprite scaling effects on the bad guys when they exploded. Best part was playing 2-player co-op though, allowing you and a friend to run roughshod over the enemy. The sound presentation was impressive as well. The voice work, the howl of the animals, you almost always heard an Altered Beast cab before you actually saw it. It may be antiquated by today's standards, but back then, this was a great time, and I always appreciated it as the Genesis pack-in. There are not many Sega games I have hated from the moment I first played them, but 1988's Dynamite Dux is definitely in that group. I legitimately didn't play this game until many years after its release, but boy was it an immediate turn-off. You are a duck named Ben trying to rescue a girl from an evil wizard. It's a beat-em-up with access to weapons, so you'd think I'd love it, yet everything about this is off-putting to me. The art, the music, the way it plays, I just can't get into it. Funnily enough, it's a Sega AM2 release, and I usually love their titles. There are folks out there that really like this, and there are numerous ports of it, including a Master System edition. It's not my thing, but you should definitely try it. It's pretty unique among the Sega-made arcade titles. E-SWAT came out in 1989 and was sort of Sega's take on the RoboCop idea. Here you start out as a regular cop taking down bad guys before getting your very own cyber exoskeleton. Your job is to clean up the streets of Liberty City and destroy the Evil Eye organization that runs it all from behind the scenes. It's basically a walk-in gun where hundreds of enemies are thrown at you in a near constant barrage that can be rather tough. I really enjoyed it though, especially the visuals, which has lots of large detailed sprites and some fairly decent animation. There's 15 stages, but they go by pretty fast, and there's 2-player co-op. When Sega brought this home to the Genesis, they used the same premise, but completely remade it into a new game. When Golden Axe hit the arcade in 1989, it was a revelation. Hack and slash beat 'em ups were nothing new, of course, but this one had a style and play that felt like nothing else. The enemies were huge and magic filled the screen with some incredible effects. The memorable cast of heroes were perfectly balanced, and the 2-player co-op was simply some of the best of its time. When you saw a Golden Axe cab back in the day, you simply had to drop a credit in and at least play it a little. It was also one of the few arcade titles that you could defeat fairly easily, and usually with only a few continues. Golden Axe proved a lucrative success for Sega, and begat numerous home console and arcade sequels that would follow in the years after. I'll never forget playing this for the first time and recognizing the sound effects from the First Blood movie. When Sega brought it home to the Genesis, it was one of the closest arcade ports I'd ever seen, and it even had an extra stage and final boss to boot. Great Sega sports games didn't start on the Genesis, and 1989's MVP sure was one baseball game worth looking into. Aside from the strange art style on the players, I really enjoyed this game. The scaling on the ball when it got hit, the small Neo Geo-like cinematics on the more exciting plays, and the fully voiced play calling were all really impressive for the time. Whenever you crushed a home run, it was really cool to see the Genesis billboards out there in the crowd. It was a maturation of Sega's numerous baseball arcade titles before it, which would eventually inspire its home games like Reggie Jackson and Tommy Lasorda Baseball. It's a bit slow by today's standards, but I still have some really fond memories of it.
Between left and center. It's over his head for a homer.
Tough Turf was a 1989 Double Dragon clone where you played some dude in a tie kicking everyone's ass. There is a heavy emphasis on weapons here, and you pretty much always have access to something to help fight the bad guys. Outside of that, it has your usual punch, kick, and jump attacks these games were well known for. It does have 2-player co-op, but it really didn't do anything special in terms of gameplay. The one area that did stand out was the music, which has an 80s electric feel that should appeal to a great many of you. Sega developed this one jointly with Sunsoft, though neither one would ever port it home to any of Sega's consoles. If you don't have any nostalgia for it, it's pretty difficult to go back and play nowadays, but there's definitely worse beat 'em ups out there. '90s Aurail is the hidden gem of the Sega System 16 library. This little mech-based run and gun plays fantastic, and even incorporates first-person shooting stages at a time when you didn't see much of that sort of thing. Gameplay has you capable of shooting slowly while moving, or cutting loose rapid-fire volleys as you stay stationary. Your little bipedal tank doesn't just scroll vertically, as the playfield is a bit larger than the screen horizontally, making things a bit challenging as far as enemy placement. Unfortunately, this one was released outside of Japan in very limited numbers, so I didn't know of or play it until many years later. Funny enough, Sega did this jointly with Westone, the developer that did the Wonder Boy titles. This was a completely different experience, and something I would have loved to have seen on the Genesis in its early days. In 1991, Success developed Cotton, a horizontal shooter starring a witch named Cotton and her sidekick fairy named Silk. It's a lighthearted affair that sees Cotton defeating enemies on her quest for candy. Gameplay revolves around leveling up your attacks and crystals you can collect for various special magic spells. It's a beautiful game that holds up well, eventually seeing numerous sequels across many different platforms. Also of note is the memorable soundtrack that really added to the fun and atmosphere of this weird world and its quirky characters. Good stuff if you enjoy the genre. You know how the late 80s and early 90s were loaded with beat-em-ups that weren't particularly special, but weren't exactly awful either? That sums up 1991's Riot City in a nutshell. It was another one developed by Westone that really puts you in the mind of a few of the early Neo Geo beat-em-ups like Robo Army and Mutation Nation. It also takes a number of cues from games like Final Fight, complete with an opening and closing cinematic, mini-map for each area, and special attacks that interrupt enemy combos. It's one you likely didn't see in the wild because not only was it mainly a Japanese release, but it was rare even there. It's worth a playthrough though, if for nothing else than to see the stuff Sega released around the same time as Streets of Rage. I also imagine that's why this game never got a home Genesis conversion. Sega pretty much had that genre down pat at that point. Our final game is something that wasn't released until 2008. Fantasy Zone 2 DX The Tears of Opa Opa was a remake of the original arcade System E version, hardware that was based on the Master System. As you can see, this one looks a whole lot better than a Master System game, coming in on the upgraded System 16 C spec. This one has a pretty interesting story behind it. Apparently fans really weren't happy with the original Fantasy Zone 2 because the Master System level visuals were a huge downgrade from the first, which was done on the System 16. This prompted famed developer M2 to remake the game using an upgraded System 16B spec, which was essentially the 16B with more RAM. The results speak for themselves. This is a much prettier game that even has a few gameplay tweaks. You can now take an extra hit when you have a weapon, and the new charge gauge allows you to hold on to your store purchases. Don't dilly-dally though, there is also a new Reaper enemy that will chase you down if you play it too long, making things noticeably more difficult. If you want to play this one today, look for it on MAME, the PlayStation 2, and the Nintendo 3DS. I think it's pretty clear that Sega System 16 had a pretty profound impact on the development of the Mega Drive and its early games. With Sega and every other arcade maker using the 68,000 CPU so heavily, it made sense to develop a home console around that technology. When the Genesis hit in 1989, the vast majority of its software was designed to look like the stuff you were seeing in the arcade, and Sega made no attempts to hide it. They even went after their competitors' games like Forgotten Worlds, Ghouls and Ghosts, and Strider that had been developed on hardware that used the 68,000. Its influences aside, I think the System 16 line was a fascinating look at Sega in the late 1980s. So many classic arcade games were born at this time, many of which came to define the company for years to come. The System 16 also gave way to additional arcade technology based on the 68,000, the System 18 and the System 24, which had a slew of titles very much in a similar mold. It was here that games like Shadow Dancer, Moonwalker, Alien Storm, and Gain Ground were born, titles that would all be ported or reworked for the home market shortly thereafter. It was during this time that my fandom began to mature for Sega. I had been mesmerized for years by their awesome looking sprite scalers, but I was settling down a bit and starting to really respect them for their game design. Sega knew how to make a game really fun, and their lineup was so different from the stuff Nintendo was making. This led straight into the 16-bit Genesis era, a time when all the arcade influences gelled into a library that just kept on giving. To say it was special does it no justice at all. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time. Good old Sega has had numerous arcade boards over the years. You have likely heard of the Sega System 16 and System 32, or perhaps the Polygon-based Model 1, 2, and 3. However, among Sega's elite arcade technology, there have been boards that didn't see a ton of releases and just aren't talked about a lot today. And one of those boards is the subject of this very video. In 1989, Sega released the System 18, a maturation of the System 16 released 4 years earlier. It was still rocking the Motorola 68,000 and the Z80 CPU set, as well as the same System 16 graphics hardware. The System 18 built on that technology by adding improved audio hardware in the form of 3 new sound chips, and dropping in the same BDP that powered the Sega Genesis. That meant the System 18 had a solid amount of sprite rendering power, 4 dedicated tile layers, and over 4,000 on-screen colors. But unlike the System 16, only one single game that appeared on the System 18 made its way home for the Sega Genesis. That means that some of you may not know much about it or the games that appeared on it. In this episode, we will be going down the list of titles released for the System 18, talk a bit about their quality, and see when and where the ports came home, if any. I've got 9 games for you, so let's get started. Our first title is Block Seed, a 1989 coin-op that appeared on multiple Sega arcade boards. Not only did it appear on the System 18 here, but it also was on the System 16 and the Sega System C. Sega essentially took Tetris, added some power blocks with different effects, and added a timer where more lines were added at the bottom. It supports a 2-player competitive mode as well. Sega had a license to produce Tetris arcade games in the late 1980s, but lacked the ability to bring them home, so we didn't see a port of this until the Sega Ages 2500 Tetris collection for the PlayStation 2 many years later. It's actually quite unique among Tetris-style games from that era, and very much worth playing if you haven't. Many of you probably recall Shadow Dancer, The Secret of Shinobi for the Sega Genesis in 1990. It was a gorgeous action title that was very similar to the original Shinobi, but that home version was actually loosely based on a 1989 release for the Sega System 18, simply called Shadow Dancer. It was here that the idea was first presented of controlling a canine partner in conjunction with Shinobi gameplay. The stage design is radically different, as is much of the music, enemy design, and art direction. Side by side, they are very different experiences, despite a number of gameplay similarities. I actually prefer the overall look of the Genesis release, particularly when it comes to the look of the main character sprite and the background layering. There is no question that the Shadow Dancer arcade release is a very satisfying adventure, however. It's challenging and falls right in line with what you'd expect if you were a fan of the original arcade Shinobi. You must defuse bombs that are placed throughout the stages. There are power-ups for your attacks as you do that, and of course you have ninja magic that you can fire off to help you deal with enemies. It was ported home to numerous computer platforms, as well as the Sega Master System, though we wouldn't see an arcade-accurate version until emulated releases many years later. Alien Storm here was released in 1990, a hybrid of a side-scrolling beat-em-up, a side-scrolling shooter, and a first-person shooter. As the name suggests, your job is to stop an alien invasion. As part of the Alien Busters, you have 3 characters to choose from, each with their own weapon types. Some stages have you facing enemies in melee range, some running and shooting, and some areas have you burning them down with a viewpoint similar to games like Operation Wolf. The visuals here have a great apocalyptic feel. Backgrounds convey a sense that the city and areas you are battling in have seen a ton of damage, lending the world a genuine authenticity. The 3-player mode amps up the action and takes it to another level. There's nothing quite like a screen full of enemies and 2 buddies at your side. While this was ported home to numerous home computers and the Sega Master System, the Genesis edition remains quite a bit different in terms of level design, enemy placement, and it loses the 3-player mode, now down to just 2. This is one of those arcade games that is infinitely more satisfying with friends, so be sure to have someone with you when you give it a try. Sega and Michael Jackson collaborated a number of times over the years. Most of you are aware of the Sega Genesis game Moonwalker, a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you are out to save children from the dastardly Mr. Big. But Sega also developed a System 18 arcade game based on Moonwalker as well. This was released in 1990 and is a 3-player top-down isometric beat-em-up run-and-gun hybrid where you use magic to defeat your enemies. If you find your chimp Bubbles, Michael turns into a robot that can lay waste to enemies with projectile-based lasers and rockets. Of course, like the Genesis version, you can use dance music to basically dance your foes to death. Despite the similarities in story and setting, this is a very different game with a very different level of challenge. Alone, you face some serious opposition, and it's not unheard of to get wiped out lickety-split deeper in the game. Since Sega developed the Genesis edition as the dedicated home version, this arcade incarnation never saw a port to anything. This was rare even back then, and now you're more likely to find a steaming pile of unicorn shit at your local arcade. It's another treasure that would be lost without emulation. '90 was also the year we saw Laser Ghost, an arcade gun game where you take up the job as a paranormal investigator who must take care of some pesky ghosts. Everything is freaking haunted or possessed in this game, and the screen is absolutely loaded with enemies nearly all the time. There are lots of cool scaling animations that look great as well. It's very difficult, and supports 3-player co-op for that reason. This was years before House of the Dead showed up, so it was really Sega's first foray into the horror gun genre. There was a Master System release loosely based on it, but as far as an actual port, this never received one. It was clearly inspired by a number of hit films with similar themes, right down to the weapon mounted on the cabinet. Don't let that comical art style lull you into thinking this was a kid's game. This one is tough, and you'll want some friends along to get the most out of it. "1991 continued Sega's baseball evolution with Clutch Hitter. Sega made a ton of arcade baseball games by this point, and each time the sound, color, animation, and gameplay improved. Clutch Hitter was the very best one so far, looking similar to Tommy Lasorda on the Genesis, but with a big uptick in presentation across the board. I honestly can't recall if I played this back in the day. There were so many over the years it's easy to get them mixed up. I can tell you that if you enjoy the sport, this is an excellent 2D rendition of it. The fielding is natural, the hitting is second nature, and the multiplayer is a blast. The only thing that sucks is that you only get 2 innings per credit, so this sucker costs you over $1 for a full game. The Japanese version had teams based in that country, while the North American release had licensed players from the majors, but lacked the team licenses to go with them. This one was never ported home in its arcade form, but the Game Gear did get a game called Clutch Hitter that was completely new. In 1991, beat-em-ups were all the rage, both at home and in the arcade. Sega needed something for their System 18, and we got the rather uninspired and extremely frustrating DD Crew. In this one, a psychopath bombs an amusement park and then takes over with his gang of misfits. Your job is to go in, kick everyone's ass, clean house, and save the day. The visuals here are fairly nice, but the gameplay is nowhere near as smooth or as fun as something like Streets of Rage. The combo system feels stiff, and the hit detection feels almost random sometimes. You can't hit more than one enemy with your attacks, which means you get ganged up on a lot. There are strategies where jump kicks are effective, but you get sick of that pretty quickly. I will say this, DD Crew has some pretty fantastic animations, and the backgrounds have some really cool effects. There were also 4-player cabinets made for it, so you could use all the selectable characters at once. Surprisingly, it's also fairly long for a beat-em-up. This one start to finish can take almost an hour to beat, so that so-so gameplay really does start to get on your nerves. The visuals save it from the bottom of the barrel, but given the pedigree Sega earned in the arcade, this one looks a lot better than it plays. Where's Wally was a 1992 release that I can only find a Japanese ROM for, so I don't think this was released in the West. It uses a trackball interface to play minigames where you try and locate Waldo, or Wally as he was known in Japan. The visuals are extremely simple, and it's aimed squarely at younger kids. The only place you are likely to find this one today is on MAME, but the language barrier definitely makes it a chore to play. Our final game is the top-down 2-player run-and-gun Desert Breaker. It feels like Capcom's Mercs, and has a very similar playstyle and presentation. This has everything you need for an exciting shooting experience. There's a dash to avoid damage, vehicles to even the odds, weapons that fill the screen with destruction, and of course massive boss fights that keep you humble. This was the final System 18 release and was initially only available in Japan and had no way to play it at home for years. Fortunately, that changed with the Astro City Mini V, but it remains MIA for modern consoles. That's a real shame because this is one heck of a good time. It benefits from a few play sessions, so you can take advantage of the strategic bombing option you have for each stage. This is where you choose an area of the stage to launch your backup planes and direct them to lay waste to that area. This can be a massive help if you know what part of the stage to target, particularly if there are numerous mini-boss vehicles. The presentation is solid, but by 1992, we had started seeing games with much larger sprites and far more action on screen. It lacks any of the real breathtaking special effects that takes things to the next level you expect from Sega. Still, it's a great game once you learn it, sending the System 18 out on a high note. Sega's arcade system boards have a very strange naming scheme. The System 18 here released games after the System 24, for example, and while the System 18 was on the market, Sega created the System C and System C2, both based on the Sega Genesis with upgraded specs. Before the System 18 saw its last release, Sega had also introduced the System 32, the final board to carry that designation. That means that between 1989 and 1992, Sega had the System 16, System 18, System 24, System 32, and the sprite scaling X and Y boards all in production. This quickly changed once polygon games became their focus, and by 1995, Sega had pretty much moved all arcade development to the Model 2. Like the home consoles of the time, polygon development became a priority, and seemed to be all the gaming public and media wanted. Most of the two-dimensional arcade releases became relegated mainly to fighting games and shoot-'em-ups from that point. The last bastion of these types of games from Sega stayed with the STV Titan, the arcade board based on their Saturn console. As you might have guessed, if you want to try out these System 18 titles, MAME is the place to do it. Without it, so much would have been lost over the years, especially when it comes to licensed games like Moonwalker. While a number of the games on the System 18 had console versions of the same name, these titles were often completely different, or stripped back so heavily they really aren't the same experiences. And again, that's where the importance of MAME comes into play. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time. Sega's sprite scaling technology in the arcade can be traced all the way back to the late 1970s. Sega then spent practically the entirety of the 1980s perfecting it, with each and every upgrade adding a huge amount of processing power to make its games the best they could be visually. Sega's hang-on hardware was spectacular in 1985, which begot additional titles like Space Harrier and Enduro Racer. The next year, Sega's Outrun hardware gave us even more, packing the screen with lots of colorful sprites that were buttery smooth. The X board in 1987 was an even bigger jump, powering classics like Afterburner and Thunderblade, games that blew away similar titles at the time. When the Y board showed up in 1988, Sega had pretty much perfected the technology, and games like Galaxy Force 2 were stunning representations of just how far sprite scaling had come. That board also gave us titles like Power Drift and the crazy sit-down shooter Rail Chase. If Sega ended its journey right there with pseudo 3D goodness, nobody could say a bad word against the sheer number of great titles it released using forward-scrolling sprite-based technology. But they had even larger aspirations in mind. A new board to rule them all, so powerful it could scale tons of sprites really fast and even do it with 4 simultaneous players. And that, my friends, was the Sega System 32 released in 1990. This 32-bit monster was supported for 5 years with nearly 24 titles that were so visually potent they looked great even beside the newfangled polygon games of the time. In this episode, we take a look at the Sega System 32, go over its games, and talk a bit about its legacy as the premier sprite scaler just as Sega was entering the Polygon era. Hope you guys enjoy sprite scaling power, the Sega System 32. Rad Mobile was developed by Sega AM3 and released in 1991. It has a number of distinctions worth mentioning here. It was Sega's first 32-bit game and the first title Sonic ever appeared in. The original was available in a stand-up unit, deluxe sit-down cab, and also a super rare R360 configuration if you were lucky enough to find it. It was quickly upgraded as Rad Rally, which added a track selection and a multiplayer feature. It uses a loose outrun style setup where you are racing area to area across the United States, pushed along by time-based checkpoints. I always dug this for its weather effects, lights, and windshield wipers, which sort of brought some real-world presentation to Sega's otherwise fantastical racing style. Still pretty, still fun, and still well worth a play. Developed by Sega R&D 8, or what is essentially AM2, F1 Exhaust Note was a dual sit-down unit for 2 players. I never got the appeal of these types of games because who the heck wants to slow down to 30 miles an hour to take turns in an arcade title? And it doesn't have any F1 licenses, so it doesn't even have the appeal to fans of the actual sport. It looks good, but I find the gameplay utterly exhausting. It's unimpressive to say the least. Sega had the Spider-Man license in the early 90s and they used it for a beat-em-up / platforming hybrid in 1991. This one has large sprites and 4-player co-op against some of Spider-Man's most hated villains. After the side-scrolling beat-em-up sections, the screen zooms out and becomes sort of a platforming run-and-gun. The animation is mostly impressive outside of Spider-Man's old guy walk, and there is a fair bit of speech that pushes the story along. It's not particularly deep with a simple moveset that is little more than a combo and a special projectile attack. But it's the multiplayer that makes this. Get some friends together and you can really dump some time into it and its world of challenging boss encounters. It has never been ported home for any platform and remains an arcade exclusive. Air Rescue was released in 1992 and developed by Sega AM1. This is point-blank the superscaler version of Choplifter. Your job is to fly into enemy territory, grab the POWs, and get back to your base without being blown out of the sky. This came in a deluxe sit-down configuration with 2 screens that actually supported 2-player missions. The first-person visuals are smooth, but cluttered, and the weird-looking POWs don't do it any favors. Still, this is a great looking game once you get the hang of it. I'd love to see Sega release a flight stick with an Astro City Mini 2 and include games like this. I only ever saw this in the arcade a few times back then, so a way to play it now would be much appreciated. Arabian Fight has to be one of the most unique feeling beat-em-ups you'll ever play. Developed by AM2, it uses full screen scaling on every single sprite as it moves to and away from the screen. That also includes the magic, which has some pretty killer animation as it fills the screen. It feels so different from the stuff you typically play, and it's another one where you really need some friends to get the most out of it. AM2 clearly meant this to be played with up to 4 people, and it can get quite hectic with all the animation, magic, and special effects you'll see. It doesn't have the depth of something like Streets of Rage, but it was meant to be a visual feast, and it definitely accomplishes that task. F1 Super Lap was sort of a sequel to the previous release, F1 Exhaust Note. Sega AM2 was back at the helm, and this time they scored a full license to back it up. No, I'm still not a fan of the nearly stop-and-go gameplay, but it should have everything an F1 fan needs to enjoy it now. The visuals are again outstanding, it's just not my type of arcade racer. Sega AM1 released one of the best-known System 32 arcade titles in late 1992, Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder. This is another 4-player beat-em-up, but it's so much more. There are some connecting areas to the various stages that have scaling features, but this is otherwise mostly similar to what you know and love from previous games in the series. The evil, good-for-nothing Death Adder has returned, and it's your job to put him away once more. Like the other Golden Axe titles, it's short and flashy, but it's a fun ride while it lasts. The only real weakness here is the selectable fighters, which lack the appeal of the original trio. They do gel together quite well as a unit, so be sure to play it with some family or friends. Sega AM1 also had Holosseum in late 1992, a one-on-one fighter that used a rather unique cabinet. This used a large curved mirror presented on a black playfield with various shapes that gave the illusion of three-dimensional depth. It was purely a gimmick meant to be taken as a showpiece experience, and not a lot more. The fighting game here is incredibly simple, using only 2 buttons and keeping both fighters right on top of one another. It's the video equivalent of Rock'em Sock'em Robots. This technology was also used in Sega's Time Traveler arcade, which was prone to failure, so this was almost created as an apology to arcade owners as a drop-in replacement. Cool as hell to look at, but rather shallow in the gameplay department.
Time of your life! Round 1. Ready, fight!
かかってきなさいかかってどう
Sega AM3 wanted to make a 3D fighting game on the System 32, and while it's simulated with scaling sprites, the gameplay itself is unlike anything at the time. It's played from a slightly off-center third-person perspective where you are either in the foreground or the background, constantly switching views as the fight spins all around you. The gameplay is incredibly difficult to come to terms with. While the moves are similar to Street Fighter, there is a button to jump and much of the combat relies on projectiles, throws, and quick takedown tactics. Needless to say, it's not beginner friendly. I always admired this one though for trying something radically different at a time when everyone else was just copying Capcom. Not a classic, but still quite the interesting piece of history. AM1's output was pretty prolific on the System 32, and they were also responsible for Alien 3 The Gun, an on-rail shooter that threw everything but the kitchen sink at you. This was incredibly fun in multiplayer, but alone, you stand almost no chance at surviving very long. Between multiple facehuggers hitting the screen, constantly jumping xenomorphs, and even crazed robots, you really do need two guns blazing to get the most out of this. But boy is it a heck of a ride all the same. The environments look great, from sterile hallways to the desolate surface. It does a fine job looking like the movies, including some nice fog and smoke effects that accent everything. It's a convincing 3D landscape using just two-dimensional visuals, and it remains an arcade exclusive. Burning Rival was Sega AM2's attempt at making a Street Fighter II ripoff. The visuals are there, with big sprites that have an animation quality well above the stuff you typically saw in 1993. But this one just doesn't play that well, not to mention the AI is ludicrously aggressive even on the first few opponents. You can have some fun in multiplayer just messing around, but this is not made well enough to be taken seriously when there are numerous better games that were released around the same time. Even Sega themselves had no confidence in this release, and it remained in Japan, where it is still an arcade exclusive. Sega AM3 had the honor of bringing Sonic to the System 32, with SegaSonic the Hedgehog in 1993. This used a trackball that you had to roll to get Sonic and a few of his friends to go in the direction you needed them to, which makes a lot of sense when you consider how the little blue blur moves. It's really tough to get him to do what you want though, resulting in some frustrating deaths. You'll mostly be negotiating traps and obstacles that are all time-based, so speed is of the essence. It's an incredibly interesting product and something Sega should have ported home with its own trackball controller at some point. It was Sonic's first full arcade showing and again, remains exclusively there even today. In 1994, Sega AM3 and AM4 came together to develop Dragon Ball Z VRVS, a fighting game that used a three-dimensional behind-the-back perspective and split screen so both players had the same view. This Japanese-only release also had a special motion-activated release where the player actually needed to do some real punches and kicks to control the on-screen action, similar to the activator peripheral for the Genesis. This actually plays better than Dark Edge and is easier to get into. The scaling sprites give it an illusion of depth that is pretty impressive, and the animation is dead on to what you'd expect. Sega's fighting game experiments were quite something on the System 32, and I think this one may be their best effort. Unfortunately, it was released at a time when no one thought a Dragon Ball Z game would sell in the United States, so I have only ever seen this one via emulation. Sega AM3 was back in 1994 with Jurassic Park, a two-player sit-down game that used a flight stick controller for its on-rail shooting. This was a visual feast, taking you through the locations and featuring the dinosaurs from the Jurassic Park film. It doesn't waste much time on a story and instead throws you straight into the action. It's fast, hectic, and is another game that really needs a second player to take some of the heat off of you. Difficulty aside, I adore this. It's so smooth, so flashy, so invariably Sega. Of course, there never was a home version and is yet another arcade exclusive System 32 release. You won't hear me say this much about the sport, but I loved Sega's 1994 release, Super Visual Soccer. It has different teams based on the region it was released in, with Europe's version called Super Visual Football and Japan getting the J-League 1994. This is essentially a soccer game played like the Madden NFL titles. The behind-the-back view changes everything for me. The simple 3-button interface gives you 2 pass options and a kick, which means you can focus on the action without worrying about complicated controls. The graphics are awesome too, with smooth scrolling and great animations across the players. Heck, I would have purchased this on the Sega CD or Saturn had Sega released it at home. It's awesome arcade sports action, plain and simple. Old Slipstream here is a weird one. It was only released in a few South American nations and was developed by Capcom of all developers. It supported up to 6 machines linked together for multiplayer, and oh my god is it awesome! It has a visual appeal that rivals most Saturn and PlayStation racing games, and the gameplay is rock solid arcade fun. Ever wondered what something like Daytona would have looked and played like as a 2-dimensional sprite scaler? Well, you pretty much have your answer here. Looking at how well this was designed, Sega was crazy not bringing this to the Saturn. With a few added features, this could have been an attention-getting game in a number of regions. But as with a lot of the others, it remains arcade exclusive. When Outrunners was released in 1993, it came in on the Sega System Multi-32, an upgraded version of the hardware that had a faster CPU, more RAM, and a more robust soundboard. It powered the dual-screen 2-player Outrunners that was developed by Sega AM1, and this is nothing less than Outrun on steroids. Faster with more music, more cars, and more tracks, it's one of those arcade games you just don't want to stop playing. Look at these visuals. There was nothing like it in the arcade at the time. It was faster and far more detailed than the early 3D polygon stuff you saw, and the scaling hardware by other companies paled in comparison. There are setups out there that feature 2 of the deluxe sit-down cabinets linked together, so you could have 4 players at once with this classic. It's a must-play that every Sega fan should seek out. Another System Multi-32 release was Stadium Cross, a motocross racer that simply has no substitute outside the arcade. This used sit-down bikes that you actually controlled the lean of the bike with the seat, and the pull of the handlebars as you jumped. This cannot be replicated anywhere near the same level in emulation, so you have to play this one on the real thing to really appreciate it. Stadium Cross also has a freaking attack button you can use to get a competitor off of you. It's a wild ride and another one with no direct home conversion. Emulation has its drawbacks, and I wish I could show you Title Fight here properly. What you see here is missing the background visuals, leaving just the fighters. It was originally developed by Sega AM3 and released on the System Multi-32. It's similar to something like Punch-Out, but used 2 joysticks for your punches. This made it tough to learn, but it was still fairly fun. It's another one where there is no substitute for the real thing. Our last game was released in 1994 and supported 6 players across 2 monitors. Hard Dunk was developed by Sega AM3, and this is just as awesome as the soccer game we went over a few titles back. This uses a half-court 3-on-3 game of basketball where you score in single-digit increments. Different players have different stats. You can shoot from the field or power through the middle for that vicious in-your-face dunk. It's pretty much Sega's take on NBA Jam, and it's absolute video crack when you have some friends with you. It's another one that uses the System Multi-32, and as you've probably guessed by now, Sega never ported it home to any of their consoles, or anyone else's for that matter.
Up for 2! for two. What's that? What's that? Now you can't.
Unfortunately for the Sega faithful out there, the System 32 came at a time when its games were far too complex to be done by the Sega Genesis, and by the time the Saturn came along, 3D polygons were all anybody wanted to talk about. That means that only a precious few of System 32's arcade games saw home conversions of any kind. The Master System got a two-dimensional demake of Air Rescue that was inspired more by Choplifter than anything. And then there was a Genesis game called Outrunners that used similar art assets, but was very different from the arcade experience. Gale Racer was a port of Rad Mobile on the Saturn, which was essentially an afterthought that actually tried to mix in polygon cars to update the visuals. And that was about it for the time. Nothing was tried on the Sega CD, and nothing else was released for the Saturn or Dreamcast. This was extremely disappointing to say the least, and even with modern devices like the Astro City Mini bringing us a few more of these home, there are still great games like Spider-Man the video game, SegaSonic the Hedgehog, Jurassic Park, and Alien 3 with no official means to play them. You want to experience these bad boys, you're gonna have to explore emulation, and as you witnessed with a number of these games, that emulation is far from perfect. Believe it or not, the System 32 was not Sega's final dedicated sprite scaling arcade hardware. In 1995, Sega released the H1 board, technology that was built on the SH1 and SH2 processors that were also in the Saturn. This board saw very limited use, but you certainly had to respect the results. Cool Riders was a motorcycle game that was very similar to Outrunners in feel, though this used a textured mapped road and digitized sprites to upgrade the visuals quite a bit. Like most of the stuff for the System 32, Cool Riders never saw any form of home conversion, ending Sega's Superscaler journey on a somewhat sour note. Even so, seeing the System 32 while it was pumping out great looking games was a highlight of my arcade adventure in the early 1990s. These games looked great, and many of them had the gameplay to match the visuals. And unlike a lot of that early polygon stuff you saw, these visuals hold up like a champ some 30 years later. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.